There's price and terms, and people don't appreciate the detail that you need to understand here. So my personal view is you can only win one, and the one that you want to win is terms. So terms is everything that happens, how you get paid, what happens to your team, earnouts, rollover equity, all these kind of things.
This is BizNinja Entrepreneur Radio with your host, Tyler Jorgensen.
Welcome out to BizNinja Entrepreneur Radio. I am your host, Tyler Jorgensen, and today we get to talk to somebody who is a bit of a magician in the business world. You see, for entrepreneurs and founders and startups, capital is such a huge thing, and a lot of new entrepreneurs don't understand, and a lot of people who have been in business for a long time don't understand the magic of private equity, venture capital, and raising money so that you can maximize exits. And we get to talk to a specialist and a true wizard in the space. Welcome out to the show, Nick Bradley.
Hey, Tyler. I've got to say that's the first time I've been called a magician. So thank you for that.
Well, you know, it's finally coming, right? It's happening. Nick, you have lived you look way too young to have as many stories and kind of success moments under your belt. But when you zoom way back, when was that first moment where you realized you were an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so I'm 51. So there are 30 years of innings, if you like to call it that, in business here. So a lot. I had a really interesting sort of start because I was a startup founder just before my 20th birthday. I started a gym business. And it was a personal training business, but back, as I said, I've already mentioned my age, but back in the late 90s, personal training wasn't a thing, right? So, you know, when you set up something like that, it was a bit risky and B, a bit different. And I made a success of it in terms of, you know, employed a few people. It was a great income for me at that age while I was at university. But then I had this kind of freak out moment where I decided to sort of give that all up and go into the world of employment. And I'll get into that in a bit because that took me on a whole totally different direction. But I think the reason that I gave up that sort of first entrepreneurial spark was I was surrounded by people then in my family, particularly, who saw entrepreneurship as major risk. And they're like, oh, it's not going to work. You know, you've started to make it work, but it's not going to work. And I listened to them, which was, I wouldn't say it was a mistake. It was certainly at the right decision at the time. But I sort of had to come back, you know, 30 years later to find that entrepreneurial piece again, which is part of my story, really.
So even though you may have left, quote unquote, entrepreneurship or being a founder, you ended up working in an industry where you worked with founders and you were a part of over 27 successful exits worth over $5 billion, right? So yeah. Sounds like even if you were in the employment world, very entrepreneurial minded, working in the entrepreneurial space, how did you find your path that direction?
Yeah, so when I did enter the world of work, I didn't just enter any sort of part of that. I worked for News International under Rupert Murdoch, who and actually his son Lachlan Murdoch was kind of involved very heavily in my development. So I was in this entrepreneurial family, and even though you're in a big corporate, you're taught to be entrepreneurial there. So even though I wasn't a founder and risking my own capital and stuff like that, I had to act in that way. So I had a long career actually in media and got involved in some of the biggest publishing companies in the world in sort of marketing, sales, and then eventually building myself up to run divisions. And again, if you're running a division in a big company, there are similarities, maybe not the same risk, but similarities. I eventually ended up at a place called Getty Images, big media company, private equity backed. And it was around that time, 15 or so years ago, that I started to learn about the world of private equity. And what's really interesting, I think, Tyler, is that I think there are different types of founders, right? You've got startup founders who can go in there and they love creativity. They love, the chaos. And then you've got scale up founders, right? And I call it founders. You might kind of challenge that and say, well, you didn't found anything. But actually, when you go into a startup and you have to turn it into a scale stage company, Trust me, you are founding.
Yeah,
You are
I
building
understand.
processes. You own that.
Yeah.
So I found myself kind of going from, let's call it, the world of corporate into private equity, where they massively value people who can scale. And I ended up becoming a CEO in private equity under investor-backed portfolio companies, as they're called. I had a reputation for turning businesses around that were failing and getting them optimized. And I eventually ended up becoming what's called an operating partner, which means you go in, you mentor the businesses, the founders that are bought by private equity, and effectively show them how to survive in a world which is unapologetically about money. So,
Right.
so I kind of, I learned my ropes in corporate, but then got to cut my teeth very, very assertively in that private equity world.
I think there's such a strong correlation as you look at your career path between you had experience in sales, you had experience in operations, and then as you moved into this other space and you had some background in kind of entrepreneurship and founding and startup, and you were able to apply all of that together. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that today's founders have when it comes to private equity?
Yeah, I think people were scared of it because you hear the horror stories, and it's kind of like a bit sort of black and white. Like, you've got your one mate who sold his business to private equity. It was amazing. And he went and bought the Lamborghini or whatever. But then you've got all these other stories about how, at the last minute, the offer changed, or, I didn't know that I was signing up to this thing, and all that. And I don't think it's 100% accurate, if I'm honest. I mean, I was in that world for a long time, but for the last sort of 7 years, I've worked exclusively with founders, helping them navigate that world. And what I think is true is that most founders are just not prepared. And most founders, and this is the thing that really upsets me, right? And why I do what I do. It's a hard slog starting a business, scaling a business. All the emphasis that founders have tends to be in those lanes. And then when it comes to liquidate that business, have a capital event, potentially earn life-changing wealth, they don't put any time into that. And that's where I think the failure is. It's not the private equity firms that are terrible. It's the fact that there's a game to be played. And if you don't know the rules and you expect to turn up and win, it's going to be a pretty shocking experience for you.
Yeah, I think there's the tactical side of that, and then also the emotional side, where the most of the friends that I have that have sold to PE and not been happy with it, it wasn't the terms, it wasn't the money, it wasn't the structure, it was the role they agreed to fill after the transaction, right? Because now they're essentially an employee. And and that was usually what killed it for like what made it a negative thing. I'm like, well, you could have just negotiated that differently or phased it out faster, because most of them end up leaving early and taking a little bit of a hit to their
well, that's actually intentional, Tyler. And there's two things I'll say here, right? And because it's a fantastic point. It's not just the role that I'm now going to have a boss, or the feeling of that. There's a massive identity change. Like, as I said, it's hard to build a business, right? And you put so much of your personality into that. Certainly a lot of the founders that I know do. And they don't prepare themselves emotionally for the transition. Yeah. And they're like, well, you're making decisions on my baby here. This is my kid. That's right. What are you doing? So you've got two things hitting you. You've got the fact that you've lost control, and you've got the fact that you've got someone that you probably don't like that much telling you what to do. That ain't a good place.
No. I also have had some gyms and been in the gym business. And at one point, I basically handed my equity back to the other two partners and walked away. And people are like, well, are you still going to come to the gym? And I was like, the analogy I used is like, I still like parties, but I don't need to go to a party at my ex-wife's house. Like, right. I'm like, I'm going to try to keep working out, but I think I'm going to find a new place.
Yeah. And that just to be, to sort of lift up the curtain on private equity a little bit here, that give back the equity, I can't take this, I'm out. That's orchestrated in a lot of cases. And what I was done, and you would never hear this unless you spoke to someone like me, there is a bench of people waiting to be plugged into these portfolio companies in different roles. So the operating partner that I was, half the time I would be assessing that founder pre-acquisition and post-acquisition to say, are they going to stick around? And more often than not, I was prepared to step in as a fractional CEO for a period of time. And of course, there's advantages to that, but there's a huge monetary value potentially to that as well, to the private equity firm, if they've planned that in advance. If they haven't planned it, it's not good, but most of them have.
Yeah. So because you saw this so many times, what was the difference between the founders who prepared mentally through skill and emotion to be ready for these events and those who didn't? And so what can people learn to prepare for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I'll give you a framing first, and then I'll answer the question specifically. There's a terminology in private equity, again, behind the secret curtain, which is called prize versus prey. And when we're assessing a business, we're assessing the business, but we're assessing the founder as well, particularly if it's going to be what we call a platform acquisition, so the first acquisition in a fund. And a prize founder is someone who knows how the game is played. They're well prepared. Their business is not only great and scalable and transferable, they've prepared themselves for the arena, right? And we see them, if I put the private equity hat on, we see them as a formidable opponent. This is going to be good, right? On the other hand, prey is this person doesn't know what they're getting into, right? We're going to be able to do whatever we want here and manipulate the situation. And that's where the dark side of PE comes in, because it's a very competitive sport, right? It is a game to be won. So in answer to your question, first and foremost, founders need to learn the rules, learn the stuff that goes on, study private equity. And not to say that, if you want to sell your business one day, it will always be private equity, but I've looked at the numbers, right? And there's something like $4 trillion in North America alone in private equity right now waiting to be deployed. There are reasons why it hasn't been. But the other thing is that if you transgress that and look what's going to happen going forward, there's going to be something like 70 to 80% of 8 to 9 figure transactions are going to have private equity money in them. So even if you get bought by another business, which is called a strategic acquisition, a lot of them are already investor backed by private equity.
Yep.
So there's someone up the chain telling the CEO of that company what to do. So my big advice is, if you want to sell your business one day, learn the game. If you have no intention of ever selling your business, then maybe it's not important, but you don't want to leave that to chance, right? Give yourself options.
In my experience, there are always two sets of rules when you're learning a game. There's the rules that are written and the rules that you kind of only get through experience, or unless someone like you peels back the curtain and really shares, right? It's like playing a pickup football match, right? There's the games of soccer, and then there's the rules of the pitch, right? And so what are some of the unspoken rules that founders need to be ready and aware of?
How long have you got? I'll give you a couple of what I think are really important ones. So I think first and foremost, whenever you sell a business, there's two main things, right? There's price and terms. And people don't appreciate the detail that you need to understand here. So my personal view is you can only win one. And the one that you want to win is terms. So terms is everything that happens, how you get paid, what happens to your team, earnouts, rollover equity, all these kind of things. And it's actually better, in my opinion, to take a lower price for your business if you get favorable terms. However, most founders don't understand that, so they just go after the best price. But, the analogy of, as you said, about getting married, divorce, the gym piece, you don't want to marry the wrong partner here. It's not going to be fun. So that's the first thing. Learn price and terms and value terms. Make sure you have a really good deal team around you, lawyers in particular, who can understand that well. Never just use the lawyer that's been your mate from college. You need a transactional lawyer, right? Yeah. Worth the weight in gold. So that's the first thing. The second thing is preparation. I talked about that a little bit beforehand, but the more prepared you are, the more that you do what I call shadow due diligence on your business really early. I often say that you've got to start preparing your business for a really high value exit, at least 12, but up to 36 months before you put the business for sale.
Wow. And
the reason for that is the things that affect the price and the overall valuation that you're going to get take, in some cases, years to put in place. So like sometimes people make big people changes, like they hire a president or a new CMO. Right, you're laughing. It happens all the time. You do that like 6 months before you sell the business. Now, if I come in and assess your business, I'm going to devalue you for that. I'm going to say, we don't know if this guy's any good. He's been there like, a minute.
Yep.
So there's all
and
those.
Probably at a big price tag.
Yeah. And just too much risk. Remember, private equity really are looking at both risk and upside.
Right.
They're going to pay you more if they understand the upside. They're going to devalue you if they think there's high risk. And that's the thing. So the more you can prepare around those things and know those things, the better. And then the final thing I'll say is, and this is a real insider thing, right? You can firstly choose who acquires you, right? If you are the prize versus the prey, but you can also operate off their math versus yours. And what I mean by that is when someone's assessing you, they're going to give you a number based on the information that you provide. And that's standard. But if you can learn as much about that acquirer as possible, particularly if it's another company, quite often they can do stuff to your business with their resources that you can't leverage, but they're not going to give you value to that. Now, if you can, through a process of due diligence, which is normally 60 to 90 days, if you can learn their strategy, learn what they're going to do, are they going to take your products and sell them to their customers, and they've got a much bigger, customer base than you, that's worth a lot of money. And what happens here, and this is really important, that can add millions to the overall end valuation if you negotiate that piece through that process. Literally, I've seen it add tens of millions, if I'm honest.
So the more that you understand the upside they're betting on, right, then the more you can try to get a piece of that through the negotiation.
Exactly. And most people just don't know to ask the question. But you're spending a lot of time with that business, particularly through due diligence. They're assessing you, but you can assess them. And that's the key piece.
So I've had colleagues sell to PE or work with PE deals anywhere from like 5 million up into the 500 million range. I'm sure numbers much different and much bigger. What is the smallest deal where a PE is a real option for somebody? Like where does a business need to be in revenue to even think that this is on the table?
Yeah, great question. And that range that you give is actually certainly a little bit higher at the start point, but that up to about 500 million is the sweet spot. And the reason for that is the way to think of it is supply and demand. Once you get to a certain level of scale, and I'll define what that is to your question, you open up the marketplace of buyers. And if you're below that level, you don't. And that's why there's some percentages of businesses that sell and don't sell. Mm-hmm. And it's what we call mid-market or lower mid-market private equity. Okay. Now, the numbers can vary a little bit depending on the industry and things like that. But what I say to a lot of the businesses I advise is if you can get your profit, not your revenue. So we want to start talking in net profit. It's called EBITDA, technical term, but just call it net profit. If you can get your net profit to $5 million, you massively open up the mid-market. So your chances of selling go from like literally 20 or 30% to up to 80%. And the valuations at that level usually start at a very low point around 6 times, but can go up into the teens. I've sold businesses or been involved in businesses that have sold for 14 to 15x as soon as they've gone over that threshold. Now, you can sell a business that's around about the sort of maybe 3 million of net profit, but it becomes harder. The businesses that start to buy you there are other companies, of course, bolting you on. But if you want to start to really open up private equity, that 5 to 10 million or more is where the game is played. And the other thing I'll say here is as you start to grow that net profit, the multiples start going up. So you can suddenly add, tens of millions to your valuation just by increasing the profit, from 5 million to 6 million to 7 million, et cetera.
Those price points are why I've seen an increase of roll-ups happening and I'm talking from my personal perspective. So I'm sure this is all very normal, but probably just because of my age and the number of, the network that I've gathered over the years, I'm seeing more and more companies basically say, hey, if I can, I'm in that 3-ish million range, but I want to get those bigger multiples. Let me go acquire a few companies so that our EBITDA becomes 6, 100%. Right? And then they acquire them at a three times, and then they sell at a 6 to 12.
100%, it's arbitrage, and that I get a lot of my work these days is founders who have got, like say, 1 million of EBITDA. So, it tends to, you can start to do acquisitions when you're at 7 figures of revenue, but once you start to get to over 1 million of net profit, the game really opens up for you. And you can go from 1 million to 5 million. I've seen it done in 12 months, but in a very, very focused manner. But I normally go and advise founders when they want to do that. And it's called a buy and build or a roll up, as you said. But it's the quickest way to get to a very high value position, much quicker than just organic growth, of course.
Now, I feel like we've laid a good background, but what you just said is, I think, where a lot of our listeners and a lot of people really need to understand what's possible. This sounds like a good time to mention that you literally wrote the book on this. You wrote the book, Exit for Millions, the private equity blueprint for scaling and selling your business for maximum value. Is this the right segue? Did I hit that? Because it feels like this is what you're saying.
I think so. I think we can talk about, at the end of the day, I wrote that book because I wanted to be a field manual for founders. Mm-hmm. And some of the things we've talked about already are in there. Like there's a whole section on prize versus prey. There's also a whole section on the 15 reasons why your business won't sell to private equity. So if anyone wants to kind of start to fix their business in preparation,
give us one of the most underlooked of the 15.
Yeah, there's some really obvious ones, founder dependency and things like that. But one of the ones that people don't appreciate enough is culture. And actually, I'll talk about brand and culture because I see them as two sides of the same coin, right? So brand is what your business looks like from the outside in, and culture is how it operates from the inside out. And quite frankly, if you haven't got strong values driving performance, that can affect that. So the way to think of this is, particularly private equity, they want a transferable asset. It's called transfer value. And so transferable means that it runs like a well-oiled machine. So everyone talks about systems and processes, and that's important. People in the right seats, that's important. But the culture glues all that together. So the more that you can communicate that you've built an intentional culture, which also the byproduct of that, by the way, is usually you can go away from the business and it runs itself really well. So there's a kind of, a value to that, even if you don't sell your company. But that's one of the ones that people don't think about enough. And it's, there's another, I said 14 of them, but that one is one that people don't talk about.
Yeah, that's huge. So you wrote the field manual and was your target reader the founder who wanted to be more prepared, or is it the kind of person who's buying businesses, doing roll-ups? Is it for everyone? Who's the target reader?
It's scale stage founders. So scale stage, sometimes people talk about like, is that 7 figures, 8 figures? I just think it's the stage where someone's transitioning to something that is, going to be led by people, process, profit. It's the transition from that startup phase into something that is a performance business. So, in the book, I do talk about organic growth and strategic growth. I talk about how to do roll-ups. But these are all, if you think of it, as I said, it's a field manual, but these are the tools, right? These are the strategies and the tactics that you need to deploy. Not everything is going to be applicable for every situation. But what I've tried to do is, if private equity are considered, and I think this is true, the best of the best at creating scalable, valuable companies, wouldn't you like to know what they do? When they buy a company and in 3 years, they've not just scaled it and grown it, they've often sold that business for anywhere between 300 to 500%, 3 to 5 times more than they've put in. Wouldn't you like to know that? So that's what I've unpacked in the book more than anything else.
You bring up something really interesting, because some of the founders that I know were almost like anti-private equity, right? They felt that it was cheating, that it like diluted their ability to really make an impact. But what you just described is that they have the ability to really five times the impact that the business would have had otherwise. So if your goal is impact, then this is a great vehicle to actually increase impact. I think sometimes you just have to put the ego aside and take the paycheck and say, hey, I'm going to pass the baton a little bit. But shockingly, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing is, like, when everyone thinks an exit, and maybe it's the wrong terminology sometimes. You can still participate. You can leave some equity in and partner with someone. And I've seen situations where you make more money on the second sale of your company than the first. But the one thing I will say, which I think is massively valuable here as well, is that if you ever get to a business where private equity is starting to sniff around, the first question that you often get asked is, share with me the vision. And I can't tell you again how many founders don't know how to answer that question because they see it as their vision. They don't see it as the business vision. And the best transactions, the best sort of transfers is where you get the right partner. They pay you a lot of money for this, but they then bring their resources to the business. And all they're doing is taking your vision and making it bigger.
Yeah.
Right. And so the more you can understand that, that's why it's crucially important. You're not really giving anything up. You're actually, you would use the word impact. You're allowing your vision and your legacy to create more impact if you get it right. Now, if you get it wrong, it's not great, but the opportunity is to get it right.
I think it's amazing. And I think the business landscape is changing so rapidly right now. We're in one of those stages of rapid development with AI and everything coming through, but also political and geopolitical landscape shifting so quickly. What are some of the industries that you are most optimistic about right now?
Yeah, it's the one thing I'm not optimistic about from an investment standpoint is, let's call it the AI industry. For obvious reasons, everyone's just added AI to every one of their pitch decks.
Yeah.
But that the idea of using technology to make businesses more efficient has been around for ages. We just have different tools and some better tools now. But I do like what is traditionally called boring businesses, right? Like, I like home services businesses. I work a lot with construction companies. I like businesses that are providing a service that's hard to disrupt. So B2B services are fantastic vehicles for roll-ups and things like that. You need to look at sort of macro trends. In the UK, for example, roll-ups of home care facilities, aged care, all that sort of thing. Huge. I also like medicine and medical because I think there's a huge transition going to that. I've worked a lot with TRT and peptide businesses. Again, a little bit startup-y, but when you see how the world's changing around health and how much money sits in those areas as well. So it's definitely not I tell you what it isn't. It isn't the sexy SaaS businesses that used to live in Palo Alto in California and revenue multiples. All of that world has changed. So I think, I wouldn't be advising people to go into that world unless they've got something that's a unique advantage around it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's the sexy SaaS business is almost like the .com era. Like it's past, right? Now you need people are back into looking for profits instead of just,
100%.
Potential revenue or potential profits. As we get here to the end of the show, Nick, I'm a big believer that life is not just about making these millions, but also living a life of abundance and a life that you love. What's one item on your personal bucket list you're going to accomplish in the next 12 months?
So it's going to sound like it's money related, but it's not. I'm moving to Dubai. Actually, I'm moving the family. I'm changing countries. And this is the second time in my life I've done this because I moved from Australia to the UK 20 odd years ago. And I'm doing that because I also want to give my children, my two daughters, a different experience. And I want to put them into an entrepreneurial frontier city. And Dubai, I think, provides that opportunity. So that to me is a big change, huge change. We haven't, I think, done anything that significant for a long time. So that's the big thing that's coming up for us.
That's a massive one. I think nothing stokes like growth as much as drastic change like that. I moved when I was in high school and it was painful, but it ended up being one of the biggest opportunities of growth for me. So I wish you all the best in that move. Everyone, if you want to learn more from Nick, one, you should absolutely go get his book. It's available on Amazon. It's called Exit for Millions by Nick Bradley. And also connect with him on LinkedIn. Just go to LinkedIn and search for Nick Bradley. Super amazing private equity guy. I think that's the full term. And but you'll find it, Nick Bradley, Exit for Millions, and you'll find him. We'll link it in all the show notes and all those kind of things. But Nick, so grateful for you sharing your experience and your wisdom here. Hope all of my Biz Ninjas, wherever you're listening, watching, or tuning in, it is your turn to go out and do something.